Professor Sir Mansel Aylward, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians and the Australasian Faculty of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, I'm delighted to welcome you to this Australian launch of the faculty's position paper, Realising the Health Benefits of Work, and its associated position statement, Helping People Return to Work Using Evidence for Better Outcomes. I'd like to start with a warm welcome to our eminent and very distinguished guest, Professor Sir Mansel Aylward, who has graciously agreed to join us to deliver the keynote address here in Sydney and in Auckland next week. Simply put, we're here today to talk about work, to propound the idea that working in general is good for people and work is good for health. The Australasian Faculty of Occupational and Environmental Medicine's position statement builds on a growing body of international research which supports the propositions that work in general is good for health and well-being, and that long-term work absence, work disability and unemployment have in general a negative impact on health, well-being and social inclusion. That return to work and maximum functional level should be seen as a desired outcome from any healthcare intervention, and that government, practitioners, service providers, employers and unions must engage with workers to challenge the prevailing unhelpful workplace ethos and promote health, engagement and productivity. These are propositions that most of us here might hold to be patently obvious, but experience tells us that contemporary reality is completely different. As the foreword to the faculty's document points out, occupational physicians and those concerned with the ramifications of work in both micro and macro settings see firsthand the adverse impacts on both physical and mental health that long-term work absence, unemployment and work disability bring about for individuals, families, communities and workplaces, not to mention the broader economy and of course the polity as a whole. And just on the topic of mental health, as the ILO has made very clear, employees' mental health issues and their impact on productivity and their social and economic costs now have a significant human resources impact. They can no longer be dismissed. Indeed, the World Health Organization has recognized mental health as a top priority. We know subjectively that extended time off work often results in a worsening rather than an improvement in the symptoms and conditions it is intended to ameliorate. We know that in the past, occupational health and safety and concepts of workplace injury have focused on the detrimental effects of work. It's arguable that this has been driven by a need for cost saving, or on the compensation system, or political imperatives, or local and global economic and social movements, and all of these scenarios have some degree of viability. But this focus has resulted in an underlying and pervasive belief that work is somehow dangerous or bad, and that it hinders full recovery from work-related injury and illness. Encouragingly, we now have the benefit of contemporaneous research, especially in the United Kingdom and the European Union, which clearly points to a beneficial relationship between work, health and well-being. We submit that new thinking about the nexus of work with good health and well-being must increasingly inform our attitudes and our interventions as medical and allied professionals, policymakers, legislators, unions, employers, employees, families and communities. That we must embrace and share the idea as we participate in an increasingly global economy and an explosion in technological and other innovations, that work is a positive element in our lives. We need to recognise that this thinking requires an open, inventive and collaborative effort between stakeholders to arrive at a collective view about the affirmative power of work, that we should be about what people can do rather than what they cannot do. In line with this argument, it is our contention that while it is critically important to improve health and well-being at work and promote early intervention and enable workers with health issues to remain at work, our attention also needs to turn towards helping those who are currently unemployed or who have become workless or who have always been workless to re-enter the workforce. so as to realise the potential they have for financially secure, productive and socially inclusive lives, not only for themselves, but for the families and communities and for us. I'm sure a stimulating exchange of ideas awaits us after Sir Mansel's presentation, but more of that shortly. I'd like to make a brief introduction of our guest. Professor Sir Mansel Aylward, CB, is the first ever chair of Public Health Wales, a new National Health System Trust responsible for the delivery of public health services at national, local and community level in Wales. He is also Director of the Centre for Psychosocial and Disability Research at Cardiff University, and this centre aims to extend insight into and knowledge of the psychosocial, economic and cultural factors that influence our health, illness, recovery, rehabilitation and reintegration. Professor Mansel was knighted in the Queen's New Year Honours 2010 for services to health and healthcare. He is a physician and specialist in rheumatology and rehabilitation, therapeutics and clinical pharmacology, a visiting professor at several universities in Europe and North America, and a consultant to the United States Social Security Administration and Department of Labour. He has been Chief Medical Advisor, Medical Director and Chief Scientist to the UK Department for Work and Pensions. He was also Chief Medical Advisor and Head of Profession at the Veterans Agency, Ministry of Defence. From 2001 to 2009, he was the Royal Society of Medicine's Academic Sub-Dean for Wales. Sir Mansel played a key role in development and evaluation of the UK's medical assessment for incapacity, or the All-Work Test, and was heavily involved in developing the Personal Capability Assessment. He was closely involved in developing the UK's successful Pathways to Work initiatives and a framework for vocational rehabilitation. He is keenly interested in addressing the health, work and social issues relevant to morbidity, mortality, work, economic inactivity and social exclusion. He has published widely. Professor Aylward's work challenges the accepted wisdom that illness and work are fundamentally incompatible, that work impedes recovery, and proposes a new vision of work as a positive contributor to overall health and well-being. He brings us a very clear message. Work is central to well-being and correlates with happiness. The faculty supports this vision and this message. In our view, supported by the clear evidence I have outlined that work can positively promote health and well-being. Professor Aylward's visit provides an exciting opportunity for key stakeholders to hear about the lessons his work offers for Australasia. As President of the Australasian Faculty of Occupational and Environmental Medicine of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, I, with my colleagues, believe this to be a very timely confluence of key players, rigorous evidence-based research, and innovative thinking. It's time for a new sense of optimism in our consideration of how work relates to the individual's engagement with the wider community in the broadest possible sense. And that's what I must stress to you, is that what I find most important about these changes is the optimism inherent in it. And that's perhaps a good note on which to conclude these remarks. However, I would like to thank all those involved in the production of the faculty's position statement, particularly the Policy and Advocacy Committee and its chair, Dr. Mary Wyatt. Otherwise, too numerous to mention individually, contributors represent our faculty, the Australasian Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine, the Australasian Faculty of Public Health Medicine, general practitioners from New Zealand and Australia, the Accident Compensation Commission, the heads of workers' compensation authorities and the New Zealand Department of Labour. I thank South Australian WorkCover and New South Wales WorkCover for their financial support. I thank Professor Sir Mansel Aylward for joining us and for giving us the benefit of his deep knowledge and expertise. And finally, thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Can I have a copy of that screed that you read out about me? Because I'd like to have a copy of that myself, and I can read it every morning and say, yeah, I haven't done so badly. Because I hadn't heard that one before. But thank you. I'm deeply honoured, and I really am deeply privileged to be invited here for this very, very important occasion. I was privileged also, I was telling some people earlier, when my wife and I arrived in Sydney on Saturday, after a long, long trip across, we went out and we were privileged to be next to Jessica when she arrived off the boat. In fact, what happened was, we thought, what's all this? Have they come to meet us? And there were thousands of people there, and we knew something was going on. We knew about a 16-year-old girl from Australia doing something unusual, but we didn't realize that, you know, we were there at the time. So it's a real honor to be here, a real privilege to be here, and a privilege to be there on that day, which I think is an historical day. May I thank the people here. I won't mention all of them because I don't know all of them. I know Mary Wyatt, and I certainly worked with her in the past, but I really, you know, would like to thank them for inviting me across to talk about some issues which are very close to my heart. Now, the only problem was, I was well, I don't know how far it is, I'm not a geographer, but it's a long way to Wales from here, from New South Wales to Old South Wales, and I wasn't really sure about what I should talk about, because the work we've done from the last 20 years particularly, not just by me, but by many other people, many colleagues of mine, particularly in the United Kingdom, covers such a wide area of work. They didn't know how to focus upon launching this particular position statement. And so what I thought I'd do was to talk about some fundamental precepts and concepts that led to our work over the past 20 years, and also to talk about the way in which the whole work, health and well-being strategy developed. It just did not develop you know, in a structured way, like the British Empire, which was developed in a fit of absent-mindedness and serendipitously. So I wanted to talk about the little stages and the quirks and the ways, the corners that were turned in its development. It started off really as a way of tackling what seemed to be an exponential increase in the number of people receiving benefits. It turned into a far, far more important moral obligation in discovering that work was so very important for health that the side issue of taking people from benefits was immaterial. The main thrust had to be work was good for your health, and we had good evidence to support that. But should I say right at the very beginning, not all work is good for your health. There are some jobs which are still toxic. There are some jobs which are unsafe. There are some jobs which are soul-destroying. Fortunately, in the United Kingdom, and hopefully, I only know United Kingdom and New England quite well. I know Australia reasonably well, and I know New Zealand a little bit. And I think in all those areas, really, the type of work that people do today is not predominantly by any means one which is associated with risk. But we must not forget the risk of work when we talk about the undoubted benefits of, the risks of being in, we must not forget the risks of some work when we talk about the benefits of work as a whole towards health. And that's just a statement in advance, because people sometimes misunderstand when you're talking about issues about which you're passionate, which I am, that you seem to forget about there is another side to the issue. And I'd like to make that clear. So what I'm going to talk about first is some fundamental precepts that sort of underpin the whole of this, really. And that is, first of all, we're talking about health, and we're talking about well-being, and we're talking about illness. And they're all words which are, you can go out and ask people, do you know what I mean by health, illness, happiness, belief, all these words? And they say, yeah, I know what those words mean. And say, can you define them for me? And it's very difficult to define any word where the majority of the experience of it, like health, is subjective. But nonetheless, we're talking about these sometimes intangible areas of life. And the main determinants of health and illness depend more upon lifestyle, upon socio-cultural environment, where you live, how you live, what culture you occupy, and psychological or personal factors than they do on biological status, and than they do on conventional healthcare. Now, that's a starter, because it underpins a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about with regard to common health problems and where they are in the picture of things. That's number one. That's the number one fundamental precept. The second one is the most important one. And all these statements we've got are evidence-based. At the bottom of each slide, we've got the source reference for them. and I presume my slides will be made available for people if they want them. Work, it's been said already by Dr. Chase, that work is the most effective means to improve well-being of individuals, their families, and their communities. And that's a statement that came out of a book that has been written by my colleague Gordon Waddell and another colleague, Kim Burton. And that is an evidence-based statement and a very important aspect of work, the most effective means. And it's most effective because of the reasons that I should be dwelling upon shortly. And the objective of all our work in the beginning was actually rigorously tackling an individual's obstacles to a life in work. And I think that's more the subject of the other position statement, but nonetheless, it's very important in looking at the relationship between health, work, and well-being. So what I thought I'd do, as I said earlier, was to take you through briefly, I hope briefly, a trip through from 1999 until the present, and how all these sort of things came together. And if we look at what we now talk about the genesis, how this work all started in the beginning, it was all to do really with the context in 1993 of the situation with regard to the growth of social security benefits in the United Kingdom. And the remarkable thing there was that the rate of growth of people who were coming on to benefit, out of work, becoming workless, was actually increasing exponentially. And that's not just a metaphorical phrase. Really, it was increasing at that exponential rate that it was predicted that by 2010, which is now, 1 in 3 people in the United Kingdom would be on social security benefit, and a half of those would have back pain. Now, that was completely illogical, completely unreasonable. What the heck was happening? That was something that was beyond just saving money, beyond just helping the government to balance his books. Something was wrong in society. There was something wrong in the way in which people were being assessed for these benefits. And we then were getting a very small glimpse, only little glimpses, of the profound effects of being out of work on mental health. We knew that many of these people who had been on social security benefit for 6 or 12 months, that their chances of becoming mentally ill, they had a risk factor of 6. They were 6 times more likely to get a mental health problem, even if the reason that they came on to benefit was because of some other physical ailment. So there was something happening, and it was then a Conservative government, and they said, you know, what can we do about that? And at that time, the idea was first to develop an assessment which was more objective, to understand what were the reasons why people were exponentially going on to benefit. And so this assessment, called the all-work test, was first developed. It was merely a better way of assessing more accurately what was wrong with people when they were passing into receipt of benefit. And before that, and I'm not very familiar with the system in Australia, but before that, persons went on to benefit merely because the doctor issued a certificate which said, I believe that you are unfit for work. They didn't even have to know what the work was. They didn't have to examine the person at all. And it was based upon a very subjective opinion. And that, anyway, is wrong. We should base all our opinions on as objective an assessment as we could. So they developed an idea to develop a much more rigorous test. And that happened. And it was based upon self-assessment, which is based upon an examination of the person, not all persons, but some persons who felt it wasn't clear what was really preventing them from following a normal life of normal functioning, and then decisions were made on that. The reason I go into all this is because we were actually now gathering data about people which we didn't have before in the United Kingdom. And indeed, when we looked across to North America, they didn't have it. And our colleagues in Europe, who we were working closely with, particularly Scandinavia, they didn't have it. We were accumulating a lot of data about why people are not working, why they don't get back to work, what was wrong with them, because we didn't have that base at all, and we were accumulating that when this test was first developed, because we were actually collecting data and making objective findings. And then in 2003, the OECD is an organization which I'm sure you're all aware of. They looked at this test and they said probably it was the best developed and most stringent test that they had encountered at that time. Now, that accolade isn't the important thing. The accolade is that they did that because they were able to actually look at the data for the very first time in a country and say, this is what has happened since 1993-94. 10 years, we can actually follow what was happening, why people were coming in and out of benefit, why they were staying off work, how long they'd been off work, what happened to them when they came off work. That allowed us to actually get grips on what subsequently I feel was probably one of the most important findings out of all this, was actually the disastrous effects of being out of work. And this is the sort of background to it. Other people in other areas were working simultaneously on topics like this, but we were actually bringing out a plethora of data. And what it first did was it questioned very severely the model that we were using to assess people. It was a medical model. It was based upon diagnosis. The diagnosis resulted in a disease or an illness or a sickness, and that resulted in a functional impairment, a loss of function, and we thought, okay, cure the disease, cure the impairment, do something with the impairment, and people go back to work. Of course they will. Why shouldn't they? There's no reason they're out of work because they're ill, because they're diseased. We found that wasn't true. In fact, the test did not work. The test told us what was wrong with people, but it was a medical model, and when the people were treated by conventional medical means in the early 90s, it didn't have much of an effect at all. It was a very disappointing result. So we had to question that medical model. And of course, what we really found out was that the main reason that people were not returning to work wasn't because of their medical condition at all. In fact, one could say that, as a soundbite, that after somebody had been out of work for 6 months, probably 4 months now, but 6 months, then the medical condition has got a very minor part to play in whether or not they return to full functioning or part functioning or return to work. It's mostly due to these other issues, which I know that you here are all aware of, but in those days, and it is, 20 years ago, when we talked about psychosocial issues, people looked at you and said, oh, is that something to do with the film that we saw, with somebody coming out of a bath with a knife? That's the way people thought. But you don't, I know, don't think about that. Well, I don't know, you might. But psychosocial issues clearly were dominant, not the health condition, in actually preventing people from returning to work. And they were the most pronounced barriers to return to work. And that 75% is in the data that we were collecting. And if you could just imagine, the data we're collecting was huge, in that there were 1.5 million people in receipt of benefit, and examinations, we were undertaking 500,000 examinations a year. 500,000 examinations a year, and we had data on all these people. And we found that in 75% of that huge number, millions of people over the 10-year period, 75%, the main reason that they did not return to work was not because of the health condition, but because of other obstacles, psychological and social circumstances. And that's where the biopsychosocial model, which had been developed or advocated many years previously in 1955 by Engel, that was something that the chap in the UK anyway, a fellow called Gordon Waddell, who you may have heard of, and myself and several others, we got interested in saying, how can we use this model to understand what's going on? The other thing was there was a complete lack of engagement with the client group, with the people that were on benefit, with the people that were tending to go on to benefit, with the people that were having health problems whilst at work. The government was over one end and these people were the other, and the twain didn't meet. And we felt that actually something had to be done about that too. And the other thing that upset some of my medical friends in those days, but I'm a physician, as you gathered by background, was I was talking about the fact that the best thing to do was to keep the doctor away. Because most of these people, unfortunately, and many of my own relatives, they went along to see their doctor with a minor ailment, which I would call a common health problem, which I'll come to shortly, and they ended up disabled, medicalized, on pills, So we said there's a commanding need here, a commanding role for non-medical interventions. We want to demedicalize the issue, not medicalize it. That didn't go down very well initially, but is well understood today. But what we had to do, and it's something that you have to tackle now, and I know you've been tackling it quite well, but it's the hurdle that you have to overcome, which hit us about 1998. All this data, realized something had to be done, starting to realize how bad being out of work was for you, but we didn't have the hard data, started to realize that many people were going on benefit when actually that was deleterious to their health, and that we should best address this issue by not just talking about medical issues, but the psychosocial ones. We had to get that concept across. Concepts and evidence. So it was no good saying, we think this is so. We had to go along and say, we have evidence that shows it's so. And we had that 10 years of good data, which is still being analysed. We were looking at the literature throughout the world, and we were having meetings with our international and national colleagues, which brought together a consensus of opinion. And that's something that you're going to be, Mary Wyatt's going to be talking about later. So we had to tackle the principal key stakeholders, and those were the government. We had to get them on side, politicians who were not in the government on side, the trade unions movement, very important. We had to get them to understand that this wasn't an exercise just to get people off benefit. It was developing into an exercise to actually help people get back into work, because we felt that there was something about work, which by then we weren't sure about, but something about work which was important for health, happiness and well-being. And that was a difficult task, but we had to go out and do that, and it took several years to get that across. Employers, we still haven't cracked the employers issue, even now, but at least we have got on board more and more employers engaging with these concepts than we have in the past. And of course the general public. And we learned a little bit from Victoria at that time, because Victoria was undertaking a multimedia campaign on back pain, and we did later adopt that, and that's another story. But we thought if multimedia are ways of engaging the public, then we should be using them. And we did in little pilots all over the UK, try to engage people in understanding a bit more about psychosocial issues, to use it as a sort of shorthand. Because we didn't want people to think that psychosocial meant something that was even, funny, peculiar and magic. And then the other thing was, we definitely realised that one of the ways of convincing the employers and the government to do something was to talk about the economic burden that this was proving to the country. Incapacity benefit then was costing the country something like £60 billion a year, right? 60,000 million pounds a year. The overall cost to the benefit system was then, and we're talking about 1998, £120 billion. The health service, National Health Service, cost less than half of that. So if you actually calculated the cost to the state of people being off work, it was that 60 billion plus the healthcare costs, which is 30 billion in the health service. We talk about 90 billion was being spent per year on people who were off work. And this was unsustainable, and it was irrational. It didn't work. It didn't fit in. But that's the way you've got to play the cards, to make sure that the employer sees that his bottom line is failing, and that the government feel that, if we go on like this, we're going to be as bankrupt as we are today. Then. And then the other thing was, rehabilitation wasn't a word that anybody mentioned. If you talked about rehabilitation, they thought you were talking about prisoners, or you were talking about drug addicts. And that was difficult. So we had to try and change that word, and we talked about condition management instead of rehabilitation. And then the other thing that was important, and I will dwell upon this just a little later, is that symptoms are all around us. Every one of us in this room have got symptoms, and if we say we haven't, then we are lying. Symptoms are ubiquitous, and some of the work we've been doing in Cardiff in the last 6 years has been focusing upon that. And as I will show you, the majority of people who were in receipt of benefit had symptoms of the same nature, of the same severity, and the same frequency as people who are at work in everyday life. Why? That's another mystery. You know, it's easy to look back and we know why now, but we didn't know then. We thought, why is it? And the first thing I was accused of was, you are saying that these people on benefit are malingerers, that they're pretending to have these symptoms. Of course, I never did say that. And I hope that by the end of this talk you realise I'm not saying that. I think those people are in wretched condition. There are other reasons why we here, who are probably all in working life, we all get our back pains, we all get our migraines, we all get our bowel problems, we all get our anxieties and our insomnias, but we're able to manage them because we don't have those extra wedges on our shoulders of other psychosocial issues which affect the way in which we perceive ourselves and perceive our illness. So there is a difference between those, although they may have got the same symptoms of severity or of frequency as other people who are not in work and don't even go and see their doctors about those symptoms. The reasons that they are different is because they both, that one group in particular, have more pronounced psychological and social issues than the other, and I'll come to that. And the other thing that we started to see now was the disastrous effects of worklessness on the individual and society. We started to pick up that. It wasn't work we'd been doing, we were looking at the literature. Then we started to gather the evidence ourselves in our own studies. And we then talked about the biopsychosocial paradigm. So I went to Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, when they just got into power in 1998. And I said to him, all this sort of stuff. And I said, can you give me, I didn't say it like this, but I did say it, can we have £5 million to do a pilot? And he said, for what? And I said, to get people off benefit. He said, don't be silly. They've been on benefit for years. It's a black hole. You're not going to get anybody off benefit by doing these silly things, like psychological stuff. So he said, go away with short, jerky movements. And I did. And I had a note from him later saying, come back when you've got the evidence. Truly, he did say that. Come back when you've got the evidence and we'll see what we can do. And we did go away. And we did come back, and we did have the evidence about 18 months later, and he gave us 150 million to launch what was called Pathways to Work. So he's not all bad, although he shouldn't talk into his microphone when he other people are listening. So actually, I more or less said this stuff, but I just want to end the sort of historical interlude. So we actually persuaded the new New Labour government that we should do something about this. And actually, we didn't think we'd have a lot of support from New Labour because we thought, that wouldn't be, they wouldn't like to be known as people who are looking at people who are on benefit. But they understood that actually there was probably, apart from the good reasons of having a good effect upon the economy, actually you may be doing people some good by keeping them at work. And so they then started to think about supporting to work policies. We had none before then, not really any. Rehabilitation, as I said, wasn't used. Supporting to work didn't mean anything. So we started to talk about the focus on disability assessment. And we actually even developed in our Royal College of Physicians, in our Faculty of Occupational Medicine, a new diploma for doctors called a Diploma in Disability Assessment and Medicine, Disability DAM. And that was another step forward because we actually now were equipping doctors to understand not just the medicine, but the psychosocial issues. You could argue that doctors should always have had the psychosocial issues, even from the time of Hippocrates. But modern medicine has sort of marginalised them, so doctors didn't. Doctors used pills to cure ills rather than looking at the whole person. And that's what you need to do when you're looking at the psychosocial side. But the disability assessment group of doctors started to spread the message a bit wider. And then when we looked at the expenditure that the DSS, the Department for Social Security, spent on return to work, it was 1.5% of the particular administrative budget. 1.5% on those people who were on incapacity or disability benefits. And yet they spent 27% for people who are on unemployment benefits. And when you looked at it, yes, there was a thing called rehabilitation, but it was called something else. just called disability something something, and they were spending 27% of the budget on that, and they were getting good results. They were actually, and all they were doing was actually talking to people and asking them what they would like to do and what skills did they think they have or needed. And that it wasn't thought of as an intervention, but it was a very powerful intervention. And we then persuaded the government, look, you're spending 27% on incapacity, on an employment benefit, and the cost to the country for that is only a few hundred million, and you're spending less than 1.5% on rehabilitation and return to work, on support, for a benefit that's costing you 90 billion pounds a year. So we got that message across. We had to keep on finding messages to get across to our stakeholders. The other thing was there was a passive provision of benefits. There was nobody had, once you got onto benefit, you didn't have to do anything else. You got a certificate from your doctor, that was the end of it. You weren't called back again, or only on rare occasions. That was wrong. That was wrong for a number of reasons, not least, again, the fact that you just left people on a dung heap, out of work, and more prone to illness, and having more illness, and nobody taking any notice of them. And again, the marginal effects of any return to work policies they were. And there was a paradox. Gordon Waddell and I talked about, I think it's the 6 paradoxes, and that was, everybody, when you talk to them about the typical benefit recipient, would describe somebody, understandably, very severely disabled, in a wheelchair, or with severe left-sided or right-sided stroke, somebody with a severe learning difficulty, somebody with a terminal illness, somebody who's in a vegetative state. Now that was the common perception of the people that were on benefit. But of course that's not true. The majority of people on benefit are not people with severe, incontrovertible impairments. They're not. The majority of people on benefit are people, 80% of them are people who have the same symptoms, the same problems as those that occur just as commonly in the working age population. So there's the perception versus the reality paradox, number one. And this is when we went out to seek views from focus groups in all sorts of areas. The health paradox, and that is, we live we were living in a country, and still are, where there was improved health outcomes in general, yet more people were on benefit than ever before. How is that? The failure to recover. You got somebody to clinically recover, and yet it didn't relate to any work outcome. And Dr. Chase was saying that we've got to look at work as an outcome, because it's a very important outcome measure. It wasn't focused upon. So you've got clinical recovery, people were fit, people were well, they didn't go back to work. Why? Why didn't they do that? Disability rights versus benefit dependency. The disability lobby quite rightly was saying, we want to change the workplace. We want the workplace to be adjusted for us to work. That was the one group of people. And then the other group of people who similarly called themselves disabled said, stop interfering with us, leave us on our benefit, please. You are infringing our human rights. So you didn't know where the heck you were. Two groups, diametrically opposed arguments. Government had found that very difficult. Were they the same group? Of course they weren't the same group. One, people had these severe, incontrovertible impairments. The others did not. They had the common health problems, and you could understand the reasons why they had different views. Lots of them wanted to work and felt discriminated against because they were disabled. The others did not want to return to work for a variety of reasons. And then the other thing was GPs, general practitioners. The sort of paradox there, that although we were now starting to see what was meant by the beneficial effects of work, doctors were still acting as patient advocates, which is their right to do, but saying, it's not my role to talk about work to patients, nothing to do with me. That's another issue, is to do with government police. I have nothing to do with it. I treat patients and I give them good health care, but I don't talk about work. So patient advocacy was contrasting with benefits of work. So we had these paradoxes. And the inequality paradox, which was, we have boundless, we did have We were number 3 at one time in the world. We were number 1 one time when you were part of us, and when we were all together in the old empire. But but we were number 3 in 1999, 2000, and we had economic prosperity, and yet we had a widening socio-economic gap. What was happening? So the reforms were, go briefly through these. We actually convinced the government this is an early intervention. I used to get cowboy firms coming to see, you know what I mean by cowboy in this context? Not people with horses and guns. No. And they used to say, Dr. Aylward, they used to, he's filming me, I shouldn't be saying these things. They were usually Americans, right? And he said to me, Dr. Aylward, we can return 60% of the people back to work within a week. And I'd say, that's pretty poor. And they say, sorry? And I say, 80% of people return to work within 5 days anyway. So you were telling me that with your interventions, you're going to need to deliver 60% back to work. But of course, all they were doing was doing nothing useful at all. People were just returning to work as they would without any intervention, as 80% of them do. But we did realise that there was a case for optimal early intervention and management. And we got that message across because before that time, both those people who were on benefits from insurance companies and those people who were on benefits from the state, they didn't get looked at till about 6 months or a year, by which time you're on a hiding to nothing if you want to rehabilitate and return people to the workplace and return people to optimal health. So we got that argument over. We also started arguing for work retention. Nobody looked at that. Nobody looked at what was happening in the workplace. And we believe, and there's plenty of evidence now to show, that the workplace is the best place to treat illness and disability. It's a very good place to have your interventions, because once you are displaced from the workplace, then lots of things happen to you, and you're not as prone to responding to interventions. So encouraging work retention and looking at something that was then very new, and we didn't know what to call it, but the Americans came up with a good word, well, called presenteeism. We didn't know about that then. We talked about people being ill at work, but they said presenteeism. And well, you can say what you like about that word, but at least it meant that there are some people who are at work and they're not productive, and it's not because they're just not pulling their weight, it's because they're not well or they're under stress or whatever. And we now know that, and Carol Black's report showed that the cost of sickness absence are dwarfed by the costs of presenteeism for firms. It's about 10 times more. So for every pound you lose in managing sickness absence, you actually lose £10 in productivity if people are still at work and you haven't recognised that they're not well. So that was starting to be, also the emphasis was on not what you cannot do, but what you can do. Cultural change was so important among health professionals, I've mentioned that to you. We had to support behaviour change. We started to realise how important behaviour change was in this failure to get back to work, by re-education, reskilling and rehabilitation. That just had not been practised except in the employment sphere. And then promote radical change in workplace culture. And then we developed very quickly an idea that why don't we therefore bring together all these psychosocial issues that we know are operating and are preventing people come back to work. Why don't we actually then just address them in a non-medical way? Why don't we just talk to people about their problems, talk to people and find out how confident they were in getting back to work, talk to people about the problems that they felt, what Mrs. Jones felt was important to her. And that meant having to engage with people, to having trust with people, and to actually using talking therapies, cognitive and behavioural therapies, and many other issues. And we thought of this concept of pathways to work, of looking at people as early as possible within the first 6 months, but we've now extended it to up to 5 years, and looking at them and finding out what were the real reasons why they were not returning to work, what were the real reasons why they were not returning to better function. And this is where Pathways to Work, helping people in deployment, came out. And there it was, I think that was a very significant step by the government to realise a vision. Better framework of support and more focused interventions, focus on the early stages of the benefit receipt, improved tangible financial incentives. what it introduced was nobody in their right mind, I think, would actually go back to work if they were earning less money by going back to work than they did when they were on benefit. So we persuaded Mr. Brown to introduce an in-work payment. So for the very first time, people actually were paid when they went back to work for the first year. And that was a major, major change. And it helped people who had lacked confidence. If I go back to work and I lose the money, I lose the benefit, how am I going to survive? I may not be able to get back on benefit. But if you go back into work and you were given a benefit, and I think it ranged from sort of £25 to £100 a week, which is a significant sum, that had a major effect as well. And condition management, that was using those non-medical interventions jointly with local NHS providers to address people's psychosocial issues. So we did that. Okay, having done that, that tells you the story of why we built up all this knowledge about work and health and gathered work from others. And I'd just now like to talk probably about what is really very pertinent to this particular position statement, and that is the relationship between work and health, and the benefits of health and the disastrous effect of work and the disastrous effects on health of worklessness. We all know, and you've had time to look at that, and you've all been able to work out that health, work and well-being are intimately related, dynamically in tension, and that each have got positive and negative effects. And I needn't go into detail with such an intelligent audience as you to describe that. But what do we know, really? Let's now talk about some of the data we were collecting, which I spoke about earlier. What do we know about it being out of work? Well, we know, we can make the statement, unemployment is bad for you. There are difficult jobs, there are toxic jobs, we know. But in general, overwhelmingly, unemployment is bad for you. First of all, you've got loss of income, and that doesn't help in any way, shape or form. Secondly, it's destructive on self-respect. We don't just think that. It's not just a belly feeling. It's actually when we interview, and we've now interviewed something like 50,000 people who have been out of work and followed them for up to 2 years, the main thing that comes out is they lose their self-respect, they lose their self-esteem. That's very important. Risks of ill health, which I'll come to in the next slide, and the psychosocial scar persists, especially if people are made redundant. If people are thrown out of a job, as they were in the Welsh Valleys, where I come from, in 20, 30 years ago, when all the mines closed within a period of 6 months, and where the steel industry closed down, and where shipbuilding stopped. And thousands, millions of people were put out of work. And they were put out of work at a time when there was no infrastructure put in. Nothing was provided, no support. And what's happened? Their children, they thought they'd been shafted. You know what that word means? I'm sure it means the same thing in Australia. They thought the government had marginalised them. They didn't think that work was no longer an ethic. There were no champions in work. And even their grandchildren have that. So we've got grandchildren of people who are thrown out of work where that psychosocial scar persists. And it's a huge job that we're tackling now in the valleys and in parts of Scotland and northeast England to try and turn over those beliefs about why should I do anything? Why should I bother? I have, my family and my granddad was thrown out of work and they've been on benefit ever since, and why shouldn't I just remain as I am on benefit? That is a very important issue. So that's that transgenerational effect. But this is the one that actually convinced people like Tony Blair, people like Gordon Brown, people like Alistair Darling, that we had to do something about getting people back to work, because long-term worklessness is one of the greatest known risks to public health. I've been showing this slide for 7 years, and I've been updating it when we got newer data, as you'll see. But it's about 7 years old because it was first used to give us a soundbite when talking to politicians. It's been used as a soundbite ever since for other things. But when you start realizing what it means to be out of work, the health risk is equal to smoking 10 packs, that's 200 cigarettes per day. And I've got the references, you can have them. Interpreting that is this: for every day over 6 months that you're out of work, the effect on your life, morbidity, chances of different morbidities, and mortality, life expectancy, is the same as if you were smoking 200 cigarettes a day. Now, not many people smoke 200 cigarettes a day, I know. This is just a figure that's been drawn out to make the point. But if you were smoking as well, you can imagine what a disastrous effect being out of work has on your life. So that's number one. The other thing, which I think is the most emotional one, and it's particularly emotional for us in Wales, because there's a little town called Bridgend in Wales, and about a year ago we had a cluster of suicides in kids, 16 to 18. And this just confirmed the data I was showing you here, that in young men, and that's between 16 to 22 actually, was the range, I think, who've been out of work for 6 months or more, compared with their peers, and allowing for socioeconomic change differences, they had a 40 times increased rate of suicide. I mean, that's massive, isn't it? I mean, that's terrible. That's a scandal that should be happening. And people have argued with me and said, yeah, but there are lots of reasons why people commit suicide. Yes, and if you analyse that data, you'll say, yeah, a lot of people committed suicide because they were taking drugs. A lot of people committed suicide because they were doing dangerous pursuits. A lot of them were in the criminal justice system and they had a problem which resulted in their committing suicide. Several, but not all, more than several, but not all, had mental health problems, poor family background. Yeah, but they weren't the common denominators. The common denominator was they were out of work. And if that's the case, it's a moral obligation on all of us, whether we're healthcare professionals or whether we are members of society, to do something to return people to work. And particularly, although we're focusing on the younger people here, particularly the younger people. But even if you look at suicide rate in general, it's increased 6 times. You know, if you had something going around killing people, and it was extremely risky, wouldn't you do something about it? If there was an animal going around with and eating people 6 times more than you would expect to be eaten, you know, you'd say, well, I want to do something about that. But we don't. We're not doing anything about it. It's a scandal. People are killing themselves because they're out of work. I don't say they do that consciously. You know what I mean? They're out of work and they kill themselves. And then the other thing is that we were always Gordon Waddle and I, because these last 2 bits are from our work, were always said, well, you know, you talk about being out of work, but what about you should be treating people with terminal illness, spending money on people with cardiovascular disease, spending money on people with COPD. That's where you should be spending the money. So we thought, well, let's look at let's compare people with sort of a stage 4 advanced COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, people with would qualify for a CABG, a coronary bypass surgery, people who were in the stage 2 or 3 of a cancer, you know, not terminal, but pre-terminal, and we looked at the life expectancy and the morbidity, the effect upon the life, and we found that actually being out of work was greater risk on health and life expectancy than these killer diseases. So what more do you want? Well, the other thing that people argued with us is, yes, but returning to work is a dangerous place. So it is, and so it was. And it certainly was in the valleys, in the mines 30 years ago. So we looked at what are the jobs with the greatest risk in the United Kingdom: construction and under the North Sea. And in fact, the risk there was at least a tenth of what it would be by just being out of work for more than 6 months. So I could stop at that slide, really, because that slide tells you all, I think, how important it is to do something. But everybody said to us, yeah, okay, you've told us, we believe you, that being out of work is disastrous. Fine, you made the point. But it doesn't follow that being in work is good for you, does it? It doesn't, and it's a sensible point. So what we did was, I was Chief Medical Officer in the department then, so I commissioned Gordon Waddle and Kim Burton to actually look at that, do a systematic review, and they concluded, is work good for your health? Yes. Strong evidence, work is generally, say generally because we want to make sure we don't want to be tarred with a brush of saying that all work is good for you. It's generally good for physical and mental health and well-being. And the important thing, like in any sort of experimental trial, if you return people to work, you then put them back into a situation which reconfirms the value of being in work, because all those adverse effects I've talked to you about disappear. Within a few months, all those risks come down and down and down. So that when you look at the cigarette smoking issue, after somebody's been back at work for about 9 months, they no longer, it's as if they've given up smoking. Right? And that's a powerful message. So it not only is being out of work bad for you, returning to work puts you, gets out of that adverse effect of being unemployed. Obviously, the beneficial effects depend on the nature and quality of the work. We've emphasised that in its social context. We must emphasise jobs should be safe and accommodating. I must say that, it's true. But the other thing that was so important, and was another bit of, how should I say, soundbite to get over to politicians and others, is that moving off benefits alone without entry into work, which would happen if the benefit system was made more tight, more rigid, more robust, which I didn't advocate, never advocated that. If that did happen and people went off benefit and didn't go on to another benefit, or had nothing but basic income support and basic sort of poverty relief, then that was associated in a very dramatic further deterioration in health. So I was always advocating, don't tighten the gateway into benefit. That doesn't work. It just happens, this happens, and now we could prove it. What you should do is start interfering. Immediately somebody goes on to benefit, find out why they're on benefit, what their health problem is, what their psychosocial issues could be, and then intervene. It's better to spend the money on getting them back to work than spending the money on tightening the gateway. And that's the sort of general policy that's being followed in the UK now. And then if you look at lots of phrases that I gathered about life and work, one by Albert Camus: without work, all life goes rotten. But when work is soulless, life stifles and dies. And that sort of says a lot. So the consequences, sickness and disability, yes, are among the main threats to a full and happy life. But work incapacity has the most significant impact on the individual, the family, the economy and society. What I'll do is, if I may pass over these just a few seconds to talk in a bit more detail about other issues, about the common health problems. I mentioned earlier that of those people on benefit, less than 25% are actually people who have objective, severe to moderate impairments due to recognisable disease. The rest are not. They have common health problems, and those common health problems are mental health, musculoskeletal and cardiorespiratory. And that's something that we picked up first in about 1999, and it's been a similar distribution all the way along. And then when we started looking at, though, if we looked at the changes that occurred from a period of 1995 to 2008, you see, and I think you're all very well aware of this, whereas musculoskeletal problems used to be the most important element of these common health problems, they were overtaken quite markedly by mental health. You see the rise in mental health and the slow decline in musculoskeletal. And that's from a paper that Gordon Waddle and I published last year. When we went out onto the street in Merthyr Tydfil, which is my hometown, and then went beyond that to look at the whole of Great Britain, we asked people questions face to face. That was the first 1,000. We've now looked at 3,000 people. And we asked them an open question about, all of us at some time or other feel under the weather, or we have some aches and pains. Have you read anything like this in the last 30 days? Very general. Didn't want to use the word symptom or anything like that because that medicalised it. And we confirmed earlier observations by a chap called Ersin in Norway that common health problems occur commonly. What would you expect? But 1 in 5 people in the street, they had one of these problems, right? When you asked an open question. When you actually asked them, as Ersin did, a specific question, how are your bowels? Do you have any problems with vomiting? You know, really sensitive Scandinavian questions, which We repeated because we had to, and some people say, I can't tell you the answer to that, but we did. And look at that, 2/3 of people had those symptoms. But the thing that's significant is that some people had 2 or more complaints in both categories. 26%, 1 in 4. And what was interesting was that we didn't go out to select these people by whether they're working or not, right? But actually, only 2% of people were not working. We did a similar study where we questioned people at random or on benefit, and we got exactly the same distribution. So what I said earlier, I want to confirm with data, that common health problems occur commonly in the population. What is the reason why some people have got these problems and they work, and other people actually just do not tolerate them and become ill? Because illness is a subjective complaint. Illness is my saying, I feel unwell. It's only when you say to me, I agree, you are unwell, you needn't take the cat out tonight, or you could stay in bed a bit longer, or you needn't go to work. That's sickness. So what we're seeing is an actual increase in illness and sickness, not in disease, which is organic, which you can touch, you can feel, you can poke, and you can measure. So that's what's happening. But why is it happening? So common health problems are less severe: mental health, musculoskeletal and cardiorespiratory. Limited objective evidence of disease. Doesn't mean to say these people are in any way malingering or doing anything in any way illness in a deceptive way to manifest illness. Largely subjective, often associated, and I would say now, since that slide was produced, always associated with psychosocial issues. And you can just read what's common about the common features about these common health problems, because there's a reason for asking you to look at that slide. Most episodes settle rapidly, though often persistent or recurrent. Most people remain at work or return to work. Essentially, whole people, this is the thing, whole people with what should be manageable health conditions. Long-term incapacity is not inevitable, and that's the sort of punchline. If you look at all these, you don't throw up your hands in horror and say, oh, good God, what do we do about it? Long-term incapacity is not inevitable. Common health problems, therefore, as a summary slide: high prevalence in the general population anyway. Most acute episodes settle, as we've said. There is no permanent impairment, and only about 1% go on to long-term incapacity. That puts it in context. But those 1% are the people that keep seeing their doctors, that account for 60% of GP consultations of people with common health problems, with difficult to determine organic disease. They make up 70% of people on benefit, and I know from insurance companies in the United Kingdom, they represent about 80% of claims for insurance purposes. 1%, so we're talking about, because there are millions and millions of people, that 1% is quite a large number, and it's going on to benefits on a regular basis. So the last line: essentially people with manageable health problems, given the right support, opportunities and encouragement. Chronicity and long-term incapacity are not inevitable. That was the thing that allowed us to talk about why do these things happen? Why do some people not recover? Clearly, it's because of the other factors that we mentioned. And we know these factors may also act as obstacles to recovery and barriers to return to work. So the corollary was, and since we've dealt with it, management of common health problems must address obstacles to recovery, and beliefs and attitudes play a pivotal role in propagating and perpetuating these illnesses. And social factors dominate too. And unless you address all these issues, then you're on a hiding to nothing. Now, I've gone on quite a long way, so I'll just finish by just talking about the government programme, because this brings this all together, called Pathways to Work, which has now been described as the single most successful social intervention, it's called, but it's more than that, in the world ever, in returning people to work and maintaining people at work in a sustainable manner for over a year. And it all began by a return to work payment, which I mentioned. You must give people the money to go, so that when they go into work, they don't have less money than they did when they were on benefit. And that was for only 6 months in the first instance. So everybody thought Pathways is going to succeed for 6 months. Once the money's taken away, boy, they're all going to drop out. That didn't happen. it was extended for a year later for other reasons. But what happened was, once people had got back into the way of working and had built up their confidence, and they'd done that for 6 months, often they had moved to a higher job in the workplace, and they were earning that little bit extra, which didn't make a big difference to being on benefit. And secondly, they were used to getting back to work again. Mandatory, the only thing that was mandatory about this, it was voluntary, everything was voluntary, except they had to turn up, as with the employment benefit, and actually talk about what they could and couldn't do, and what they were prepared to do in a job of work, and whether or not they would volunteer to go on this condition management program. They didn't have to go on these condition management rehabilitation programs because they included cognitive behavioral therapy. And you can't say to somebody, you must go on cognitive behavioral therapy. You know, that is really, although there are some idiots that do that, but you can't. And these new condition management were focused on those three areas: musculoskeletal, mental health, and cardiorespiratory. And they were, well, I needn't go into great detail, helping people to understand and manage their condition. That was important more than anything else. I won't go into that, it's just in any detail, it just gives you the principles of condition management. But there are a couple of points on there. Goals were owned by both sides. The case manager, the rehabilitation specialist, both owned, non-judgmental, what's the problem, let's work at this together. Case managed, tailored to individual needs. And the biopsychosocial approach isn't one where you do the biological bit and the psychological bit and the social bit separately. They all work together. I know when I go to Boston, or did go to Boston, when I went to Boston several years ago, and I talked to people who were doing this, they'd say, how do you manage your people rehabilitation-wise? And they'd say, we use the biopsychosocial approach. And I say, I'm very pleased about that. Tell me what you do. And they said, well, we look at the biological issues, then we look at the psychological issues, then we look at the social issues. Yeah. And what do you do then? Then we look at the health issues, then we look at the psychiatric issues, and we look at the social issues. I stopped at that point because there was no point in going any further. But the point is, you don't do it like that. I mean, you do it, but you've got to mix it all together. It's an interactive thing. So you've got to look at it in a holistic sort of way. And that was what was done in this program. And what it did was it helped people to modulate expectations, exploit their values, and it built confidence, because confidence was the major determinant of whether or not people returned to work, how their confidence had changed. Even if their health condition had got worse, we showed that an increase in confidence was associated with that person returning to work, despite the level of health condition. Recognise and address the social context of health, disadvantage, and economic inactivity, obviously. Promote those emotional and physical well-being, and encourage behaviour change by adopting a number of different talking therapies. But the other thing was to, instead of worrying about fatigue and pain, which are common among all of us, living with it, accepting it, and realising that if you become inactive, you're likely to worsen your life expectation and worsen your life anyway. So it's those sort of coming together, talking, thinking, joining, engaging, common ownership, but with people who are very trained to deliver cognitive and behavioural therapy. And the principal findings was that rather than aiming for control of the health condition, successful outcomes were dependent on learning processes towards self-management and independence. So very important. New roles were there for health professionals, support and guidance rather than take this pill 3 times a day after food. I think that was the other issue that came across. The Pathways to Work has been extremely successful. Condition management programs have resulted initially in a doubling of claimants going to work. The latest figures show 6 times the number of people going to work. We don't know what the recession is going to do to that, but the government, the new government, the Liberals and the Conservatives before the election committed themselves to continue with this program because it's been so successful. Higher than expected take-up rates. In the past, if you got a 1% take-up rate for a government program, rehabilitation program, you were very, very lucky. 2.5% was considered a huge increase. These are 35, 40, 50% uptake. Exceeds threshold for cost effectiveness. For every pound that you pay on this program, you get £14 back. So you can't, that's a good rate of return. And perceived, I say perceived to have long-lasting effects because it's only been going for about 3 or 4 years. And so far, the people who return to work, the attrition rate is quite low. So the reason for me going on and on about this, and I'm sorry to go on and on about it, is that this is the culmination of all that theory. This is the culmination of passion in we must do something to return people to work. Conventional ways don't work, the medical model doesn't work, we've got to try and find out why people stay off work, what can we do to get them to return to work, not because we want to help the government with its bill, but we want to actually return people to a healthier, happier, and a life of well-being. And that's what drives me, and that's what drives most of the people that work with us in this area. We're not working for the government, but the government should take notice of these findings, because to neglect them, to turn a blind eye to them, means that the government are going to lose a lot of money unless they actually fund this sort of program and fund the positions, the things I've forgotten about the position statement, and fund the recommendations which are clearly articulated in the position statement, which it chimes so much with this. So I'm not going to go any further. I think all I can say is that's my conclusions about Pathways to Work and the whole programme of health, work and well-being, which is being followed now. Very few, if any, and these are referenced because they're independent of us, very few, if any, social security interventions in the world have ever achieved such take-up rates, labour market outcomes and enthusiasm. Strong potential to reverse the long history of failed international efforts to address successfully long-term incapacity. I hope I've been relevant. Probably I haven't. I never do. I'm usually wander. It's my Welshness. But I hope I passed some information along and I haven't spoken too long. Thank you very much.